Coaching his final game or two for Chicago. Earlier today, I asked Jackson to look back on some of his most memorable moments as coach of the Bulls.
I think probably the most important moment is maybe the first meeting I had with Michael Jordan when I was the head coach and told him what we were going to do. Key moment for our team growing and the system being bought by Mike.
Obviously, Derek's got a learning process, but we think that his experience for the last 3 or 4 years has been one of more assistant coach player role.
He coached the biggest egos, the brightest stars, and the most volatile personalities the NBA has ever seen. And somehow, he made it all work. Phil Jackson didn't just win. He redefined winning. 13 NBA titles, 6 with the Bulls, 5 with the Lakers, and 2 as a player. 11 rings as a head coach, more than any man in league history. And he didn't do it by barking orders or micromanaging every possession. He did it by managing minds, by creating unity out of chaos, and by turning individuals into dynasties. But behind every triangle event, behind every Zen meditation session, behind every championship parade, were players. Players who bought in, challenged him, frustrated him, evolved with him, and a few who earned his deepest respect. This video isn't about who scored the most or who made the Hall of Fame first. It's about the 7 players Phil Jackson trusted at the highest level, the ones who embraced his system, who showed up in the biggest moments, and who, whether stars or role players, embodied the philosophy that made Phil Jackson the most successful coach the league has ever known. From generational icons to unlikely glue guys, these are the 7 basketball players who meant the most to Phil Jackson's legendary coaching journey. Let's start with the one player who tested every boundary, but delivered greatness when it mattered most. But before proceeding, please take a second and subscribe and like this video. It will be very motivation for us. There is no player in NBA history quite like Dennis Rodman, a Hall of Famer who averaged fewer than 8 points per game, a defensive specialist who became a global icon, a rebounding machine with a punk rock soul, multicolored hair, and a habit of disappearing mid-season. For most coaches, Rodman would have been a disaster waiting to happen. For Phil Jackson, he became essential. When the Chicago Bulls brought in Dennis Rodman before the 1995-96 season, it wasn't just a basketball move. It was a gamble on culture, chemistry, and control. Rodman had just come off 2 tumultuous seasons with the San Antonio Spurs, where his behavior clashed with the organization. His rebounding numbers were historic, but so were the headaches. Phil Jackson inherited a player known more for controversy than cohesion, but Jackson didn't try to change Rodman. He didn't issue ultimatums or demand conformity. Instead, he studied him. He tried to understand Rodman on a deeper level, who he was, what he needed, how he processed the game, and why his chaos could also be his power. Phil applied his unique coaching philosophy, a blend of Native American teachings, Zen Buddhism, and behavioral psychology, to a player the league had already written off as unmanageable. And it worked. The results were immediate and overwhelming. In his first season under Phil Jackson, Rodman led the league in rebounding with 14.9 per game. The Bulls won an NBA record 72 games. More importantly, Rodman fit. He played within the triangle offense, took care of defensive assignments, set bruising screens, and handled the dirty work so Jordan and Pippen could shine. But the relationship wasn't always smooth. There were absences, fines, unexplained nights away from the team. Most famously, Rodman's mid-season trip to Las Vegas during the 1997 to 1998 season. For any other coach, that could have fractured the locker room. For Phil Jackson, it was a case study in managing energy and trust. When Rodman went missing, Jackson didn't panic. He didn't berate him in the media or suspend him on the spot. He let Rodman burn off steam. Jackson believed in elasticity, that holding on too tight to a volatile personality only guaranteed an explosion. Instead, he gave Rodman room. When he returned, there were no grudges. He got back to work. The team didn't fracture, it rallied. The key to their relationship wasn't control, it was respect. Jackson saw Rodman not just as a disruptor, but as someone who wanted to be understood. In film sessions, Rodman was locked in. He studied footwork. He memorized opposing tendencies. He watched how rebounds came off different rims in different arenas. His basketball IQ, especially on defense and rebounding, was elite, and Jackson treated him as such. There's a famous story that underscores their connection. After one game, Jackson called a team meeting and asked Rodman to explain how he chased rebounds. Rodman stood up and began detailing how he adjusted to the spin of a shooter's release, how a shot from the corner bounced differently than one from the wing, how left-handed shooters created different angles off the rim. Jackson was using the moment to highlight Rodman's genius, to show the team that this was not madness, it was mastery. Rodman played 3 seasons for Phil Jackson in Chicago. In that time, he led the league in rebounding each year, won 3 straight championships, and never once disrupted the Bulls' championship focus beyond recovery. He wasn't just tolerated, he was depended on. He guarded Karl Malone in the finals. He frustrated Shaquille O'Neal in the post. He dove for loose balls, boxed out 7-footers, and turned every possession into a war. Phil Jackson trusted him in every moment that mattered. Years later, Jackson would reflect on Rodman in interviews with an unexpected tone, appreciation, not for the drama, but for the discipline hidden beneath it, for the fact that when the lights were brightest, Dennis Rodman was all in. He wasn't a project, he was a pro in his own way, and Jackson never needed him to be anyone else. That's what made the relationship special. Dennis Rodman didn't lead the team in scoring. He wasn't the face on the poster, but in Jackson's eyes, he was one of the most important players to ever put on a Bulls uniform. Because greatness, as Jackson often reminded his players, wasn't just about talent. It was about fitting your role so well that you elevated everyone else. Rodman didn't just fit, he anchored. And under Phil Jackson's guidance, one of the most misunderstood players in NBA history became a 3-time champion, not in spite of who he was, but because Phil Jackson let him be. Before Phil Jackson took over the Bulls in 1989, Michael Jordan was already the most electrifying force in the NBA. He had 3 scoring titles, an MVP, and a gravity-defying style that turned him into a global icon. But what he didn't have, not yet, were championships. For all his dominance, Jordan's Bulls had been repeatedly eliminated by the Detroit Pistons in the playoffs. He was averaging over 30 points per game in those runs, but the offense revolved almost entirely around his individual brilliance. Phil Jackson, with assistant Tex Winter, brought in something radically different, the triangle offense. To many, it looked like a demotion for Jordan. Fewer isolations, more ball movement, more trust in role players. But Jackson believed in a different kind of greatness, one rooted in structure, spacing, and mental clarity. He wasn't trying to suppress Jordan, he was trying to elevate the entire team around him. At first, Jordan didn't love it. He was used to carrying the scoring load and controlling the tempo. The idea of taking the ball out of his hands more often wasn't appealing, especially for a player who once averaged 37.1 points per game in a single season. But Jackson made his case. If Jordan wanted to be more than just a highlight machine, if he wanted to lead a dynasty, he'd need to lead differently. And that's where the relationship really began. Jackson understood that coaching Jordan wasn't about commanding him, it was about partnering with him. He gave Jordan just enough freedom to be himself, while slowly introducing new principles: ball movement, reading space, trust. As the triangle took shape, so did a new version of Jordan, one who could dominate both as a scorer and as a facilitator, one who could break a defense or patiently wait for the perfect cut. By the 1990-91 season, it all came together. The Bulls finished with 61 wins and cruised through the playoffs. They swept the Pistons, the same team that had sent them home 3 straight years, and dismantled the Lakers in the finals. Jordan was still lethal, averaging 31.2 points per game in the finals, but it was how he scored, when he passed, how he led, that had changed, and behind all of it was Jackson. Jackson's influence wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. He introduced Jordan and the rest of the team to Zen practices, mindfulness exercises, and pre-game readings that emphasized inner calm. Jordan later credited Jackson with helping him manage the emotional weight of pressure situations. He once said Jackson helped him calm his body and emotions in big moments, and that grounding was part of what made him even more clutch. Their trust was never louder than during the 1992 NBA Finals. In Game 1 against the Trailblazers, Jordan erupted for 35 points in the first half, 6 of them from behind the arc. It was a showcase of what he could still do when unleashed. But by Game 6, with the title on the line, Jackson shifted the offensive balance. He called plays that flowed through Pippen, through Horace Grant. Jordan didn't force it. He trusted the system. The Bulls won the game and the series, and that became the norm. Through their first three-peat, 1991, 1992, 1993, Jackson and Jordan perfected their rhythm. Jackson didn't just coach the team, he mediated egos, managed locker room tension, and kept the spotlight focused on the mission, not the noise. Jordan, in return, gave Jackson something most coaches never get: complete buy-in from the league's best player. When Jordan returned from retirement in 1995, it didn't take long to rekindle the partnership. Within a year, the Bulls were back in the finals. By 1998, they'd completed their second three-peat, and Jordan had cemented his place atop the sport. 6 titles, 6 finals MVPs, all under Jackson's leadership. One of their most defining moments came in the final seconds of Game 6 of the 1998 finals. Jordan, drained but locked in, hit the iconic game winner over Brian Russell. But behind that shot were years of trust. Jackson trusting Jordan with the moment, Jordan trusting Jackson with the vision. Their bond was never overly emotional or public. It was professional, professional, focused, rooted in mutual respect. Jordan has said in interviews that Jackson was the only coach who truly understood him, not just as a player, but as a competitor, a thinker, a leader. Jackson knew how to challenge him without undermining him. He knew when to lean in and when to let Jordan take over. That kind of relationship is rare, and it produced the most iconic run in modern NBA history. Phil Jackson didn't change who Michael Jordan was. He gave him the structure, the space, and the spiritual discipline to be the best version of himself. Not just the best scorer in the league, but the ultimate winner. When people talk about the Chicago Bulls dynasty of the 1990s, Luc Longley's name rarely gets mentioned first, or second, or even third. He was never the most vocal guy in the room, never the flashiest, no MVPs, no highlight dunks. But if you ask Phil Jackson, the man who coached that dynasty into the history books, Longley wasn't just important, he was essential. And that word essential carried real weight in Jackson's world. Luc Longley was the first Australian ever to play in the NBA. He arrived with a quiet demeanor, a 7'2" frame, and a surprisingly sharp understanding of the game. But it wasn't just his size that caught Jackson's attention. It was how seamlessly he absorbed complexity. The triangle offense, Jackson's lifeblood, required more than just basketball skill. It demanded awareness, timing, selflessness, and the ability to make reads in real time. Longley, despite his relatively low scoring numbers, was one of the best at executing it. Phil often praised Longley for his feel. While most centers were focused on blocks and post moves, Longley was more like a conduit. He moved the ball, he read the floor, he set screens at exactly the right angle, slipped into space without needing to be told, and understood when to reset the offense rather than force a rushed shot. For a coach like Jackson, who wanted movement over isolation and patience over panic, that mattered immensely. And it didn't hurt that Longley had the kind of calm, introspective personality that Jackson gravitated toward. While other players chased the spotlight or got caught in the emotional chaos of the league, Longley had the rare ability to be both present and detached. He didn't get rattled. He didn't chase stats. He showed up, did his job, and made everyone around him better, especially the stars. Jordan and Pippen respected him because he wasn't trying to prove anything. He just played. He made their jobs easier, quietly taking the toughest defensive assignments in the post, battling with bigger, stronger centers like Shaq, Ewing, and Mourning. Guys who often outweighed him and came with a full head of steam. Longley wasn't the kind of guy to start fights, but he never backed down either, and Jackson loved that balance. Toughness without ego, skill without drama. But Jackson's appreciation for Longley went beyond the court. He once said in interviews that Longley brought a worldliness to the locker room. He played the didgeridoo. He read literature. He had this laid-back Australian cadence, but would drop philosophical takes on life, travel, and culture during long road trips. In a locker room full of alphas, intense competitors, and massive personalities, Longley was a kind of stabilizer. He reminded everyone, including Jackson, that basketball was just one part of life. In the 1995-96 season, when the Bulls went 72-10 and launched the most dominant stretch in league history, Longley was their starting center. That season wasn't just about Jordan's return or Rodman's rebounding. It was also about cohesion, structure, timing. And Luc was the glue guy in the front court. He averaged just over 9 points and 5 rebounds per game, but his role went far deeper than the stat sheet. Jackson often pointed out how Luc's presence allowed the triangle to flow, especially when the defense clamped down on Jordan and Pippen. One moment that stood out to Jackson came in the 1997 finals. The Bulls were up against a rugged Utah Jazz team led by Karl Malone and John Stockton. The games were physical, slow-paced, and suffocating. Longley, who had struggled with injuries earlier in the playoffs, stepped up in Game 3, scoring 12 points, grabbing 8 boards, and setting a tone inside. But it wasn't the box score Jackson cared about. It was the way Longley made reads under pressure. When the Jazz doubled Jordan, Longley flashed to the open space, caught the swing pass, and made the next play every time. He didn't freeze, he didn't force it, he kept the triangle humming. Years later, Jackson would say that Longley was undervalued by the public, but never by his teammates or coaches. He wasn't going to win headlines, but he helped win championships. 3 of them, in fact, in 1996, 1997, and 1998, all with Longley starting at center. After the Bulls dynasty ended, Longley eventually retired and returned to Australia. He largely stepped away from the public spotlight, but Jackson never forgot him. In 2020, when ESPN's The Last Dance aired and Longley was notably absent for most of the documentary footage, Jackson publicly acknowledged how disappointing that was, not just for Longley, but for the story of the Bulls as a whole. He said, "Luc was one of those guys who didn't need the credit, but earned every ounce of it." For Jackson, greatness wasn't just about scoring titles or all-star appearances. It was about alignment, about the right person in the right role at the right time. And in that sense, Luc Longley was perfect. He didn't demand the ball, he didn't chase stats, he just anchored the system, grounded the locker room, and gave Jackson exactly what he needed, night after night, quietly, effectively, and without ever asking for more. That's why, in a list filled with legends, Phil Jackson always made room for Luc Longley. Phil Jackson had many stars during his career, MJ, Shaq, Kobe, but there was one player he described as the most complete basketball player I ever coached. That player wasn't the leading scorer. He wasn't the face of a billion-dollar shoe empire. He was the guy who did everything and asked for nothing. Scottie Pippen. For Phil Jackson, Pippen was more than just a sidekick to Michael Jordan. He was the connective tissue of the greatest basketball team ever assembled. The Swiss Army knife who guarded 5 positions, ran the offense when needed, and sacrificed his individual numbers to keep the machine running. But Jackson's admiration for Pippen went beyond versatility. It was about trust. When Phil took over the Bulls as head coach in 1989, he inherited a team that was still figuring out how to get over the hump. They had Jordan, arguably the most talented player in the league, but not the hardware. In those early days, the offense revolved entirely around MJ. Everything funneled through him. Sustainable, number. Jackson, alongside Tex Winter, began implementing the triangle offense, a system built on movement, spacing, and equal opportunity. And while Jordan resisted at first, Pippen embraced it immediately. Phil later said, Scottie had the perfect temperament for the triangle. He didn't need to dominate the ball to feel valuable. He just wanted to win. Pippen's buy-in was critical. He became the conduit between Jackson's vision and the team's execution. On defense, he was Jackson's weapon of choice, the guy who could guard Magic one night, shut down a scoring guard the next, and still protect the rim in help situations. Offensively, he initiated the triangle, made secondary reads, and adapted to every role: scorer, facilitator, decoy, whatever was needed. One of Jackson's most revealing coaching moments came not during the championship, but during Jordan's first retirement in 1993-94. With MJ gone, all eyes turned to Pippen. Could he carry the team? Could he lead? Phil Jackson never doubted it. He knew Pippen had waited patiently in the shadows. Now, it was his team. That season, Pippen averaged 22 points, 8.7 rebounds, 5.6 assists, nearly 3 steals, and finished third in MVP voting. But more importantly, he led the Bulls to 55 wins, just 2 fewer than the year before with Jordan. Jackson always pointed to that season as proof of Pippen's greatness, not because of the numbers, but because of the leadership. Pippen wasn't just filling a void, he was redefining what a leader looked like in the NBA. Quiet, composed, team first. There was one moment, though, that nearly fractured their bond. Game 3, 1994 playoffs, Knicks versus Bulls, tie game, final seconds. Jackson draws up the last play for Tony Kukoc, not Pippen. Scottie refused to go back in. For Jackson, it was a rare moment of disappointment. But instead of blowing it up in the media, he addressed it privately. And just as quietly, Pippen owned it. He apologized to his teammates, to Phil, then went out the next game and poured everything back into the team. Jackson would later say that moment taught him more about Scottie than any win. He made a mistake, then he grew from it. That's leadership too. When Jordan returned in 1995, the Bulls were different, stronger, smarter, and Pippen was the reason why. Jackson often described the second three-peat, 96-98, as more sophisticated basketball, less about Jordan saving the day, more about the system working in harmony. And again, Pippen was the system's foundation. In the 1996 season, the one where the Bulls went 72-10, Pippen was arguably their best all-around player. He led the team in assists and steals, finished second in scoring and rebounding, and anchored the league's best defense. Jackson constantly leaned on him during tough stretches, often calling Pippen our compass. Even when injuries piled up or Jordan had an off night, Phil knew he could trust Pippen. There was a night in March 1996 against the Lakers. Jordan struggled with his shot, so Jackson handed the offense to Scottie, who calmly dropped 30 with 9 rebounds, 6 assists, and 3 steals. No flair, just substance. Off the court, their relationship was built on mutual respect. Jackson understood Pippen's upbringing, how he came from a small Arkansas town, the youngest of 12, no scholarships until late. That humility stayed with him. He wasn't political in the locker room. He wasn't dramatic in interviews. He was the anchor. Years later, when asked who made the triangle offense work, Jackson said, Michael gave it the edge. Scottie gave it the structure. But it wasn't just Chicago. When Phil Jackson returned to coaching in 1999 with the Lakers, he often compared young Kobe Bryant to Pippen. He said Kobe had Scottie's tenacity, his defensive potential, but needed to learn his discipline. That's how high Pippen's bar was. To Phil, Scottie wasn't just a Hall of Famer. He He was the standard, the guy who sacrificed just enough of his own spotlight to let greatness happen around him. Not many superstars are willing to do that. When Pippen was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2010, Jackson stood by his side, glowing with pride. In his speech, he said, "Michael may have been the fire, but Scottie was the framework. And if you understand Phil Jackson's basketball philosophy, balance, harmony, role acceptance, there may be no player who embodied it more fully than Scottie Pippen." If you had asked fans in the early 2000s to name the most important players on those championship Lakers teams, Derek Fisher's name might not have come up first. But if you asked Phil Jackson, Fisher was indispensable. He wasn't a scoring machine, he never made an all-star team, and he didn't light up box scores. But for Jackson, Fisher was the connective tissue, the player who embodied discipline, leadership, and trust. Not just in big moments, but in the mundane, daily grind that separates champions from contenders. Fisher was drafted by the Lakers in 1996, the same year as Kobe Bryant. But unlike Kobe, his entry into the league came with little fanfare. He wasn't a phenom or a future franchise cornerstone. He was a solid guard out of Arkansas Little Rock, mature, steady, coachable, and Phil Jackson noticed. When Jackson arrived in LA in 1999, the team had star power but lacked internal structure. Shaquille O'Neal was already a force of nature. Kobe was ascending rapidly, but egos clashed, ball movement stagnated, and the defense was inconsistent. Jackson knew the triangle offense could bring order, but it also required players who would sacrifice ego for the system. That's where Fisher came in. While other guards might have chafed at the triangle's demands, Fisher embraced it. He wasn't asked to dominate the ball. He didn't need 20 shots a night. His job was to space the floor, move without the ball, communicate defensively, and keep the team grounded in high-pressure moments. He did all of it, and more. Jackson quickly saw Fisher as more than just a role player. He became the voice in the huddle that others respected, even when the stakes were highest. He challenged teammates privately, took responsibility when mistakes were made, and always backed up his leadership with poise on the floor. One game in particular etched Fisher's name into NBA playoff history. Game 5, 2004 Western Conference Semifinals, Spurs versus Lakers. The series was tied 2-2. Tim Duncan had just hit an incredible shot with 0.4 seconds left, giving the Spurs a 1-point lead. It looked like the Lakers were finished, but Jackson drew up a sideline out-of-bounds play. Gary Payton was the inbounder. The ball found Fisher, who caught it, spun, and launched in one motion, all before the buzzer. It dropped. The Lakers won 74-73, and with it, Fisher carved out one of the most unforgettable moments of Jackson's coaching tenure. That shot wasn't just a fluke, it was the culmination of years of trust. Jackson believed in Fisher because he had earned it, through consistency, through humility, and through his ability to rise in moments others shrank. But Fisher's legacy under Jackson wasn't built on just one shot. During the 2009 and 2010 back-to-back championship runs, Fisher's influence deepened. He was older, no longer as quick defensively, and critics questioned whether he should still be starting. But Jackson stood by him, because when it mattered, in fourth quarters, in playoff road games, in those tense huddles where everything could unravel, Fisher remained the calming voice Jackson needed. In his book 11 Rings, Jackson wrote about Fisher's spiritual leadership and how his presence grounded the team when emotions ran high. Fisher didn't lead by volume, he led by presence, and that presence made him essential. Even in Game 3 of the 2010 NBA Finals against the Celtics, Fisher once again proved why Jackson trusted him. He scored 11 points in the fourth quarter, most of them tough, physical drives to the rim, to help the Lakers regain control of the series. After the game, Kobe Bryant, not easily impressed, said, "He's the heart and soul of this team."
He's the guy that pulls everybody together. He's the heart and soul of this team. Simple.
Off the court, Jackson and Fisher shared a mutual understanding. They weren't close in personality, Jackson the philosophical mentor, Fisher the quiet operator, but their values aligned. Discipline, control, clarity under pressure. Jackson once said Fisher reminded him of a point guard version of a Zen monk, always composed, always watching, never overwhelmed. And when Jackson took the job as Knicks president in 2014, he didn't turn to a flashy name to coach his team. He turned to Fisher, a man who had never coached a game but who, in Jackson's mind, had already proven he understood leadership in its purest form. That coaching experiment didn't work out, but the faith Jackson showed speaks volumes. Because to Phil, Fisher was more than a role player. He was an extension of his own voice on the court, a translator of the triangle, a stabilizing presence in dynastic chaos. No, Derek Fisher won't appear on many all-time great lists, but for Phil Jackson, when the pressure was highest and the margin for error razor thin, Fisher was who he trusted to be there. And sometimes, all you need is 0.4 seconds and the right man in the right place. Phil Jackson had coached some of the most dominant big men in NBA history: Shaquille O'Neal, Dennis Rodman, Horace Grant. But when Pau Gasol arrived in Los Angeles in 2008, Jackson found something different. Not just size or strength, but a blend of intelligence, elegance, and humility that fit perfectly into the triangle offense and transformed the Lakers from fragile contenders into back-to-back champions. It wasn't just that Pau was talented. That much was clear. He was a 7-footer who could pass like a point guard, shoot with touch, defend in space, and read the game like a grandmaster. But Phil saw something deeper, a cerebral competitor who craved harmony on the floor and excellence in his role. The trade that brought Gasol to LA in February 2008 wasn't just a roster move, it was a philosophical turning point. The Lakers, led by Kobe Bryant, were stuck in limbo after the Shaq era. Kobe was putting up scoring titles, but the team lacked cohesion. Jackson knew Kobe needed a partner, not just someone who could score or rebound, but someone who could think the game beside him. Enter Pau. From day one, Jackson saw how seamlessly Gasol could operate within the triangle. Where other big men might struggle with spacing, timing, and reading defensive pressure, Gasol seemed to breathe the system. He wasn't loud, he didn't demand touches. He simply moved to the right spots, made the right passes, and elevated the flow of the entire offense. Phil once described Pau as a player who understood the geometry of basketball. That wasn't just praise. It was recognition that Pau saw the court as Jackson did, not as a series of plays, but as a living organism. Every movement had intention, every decision had ripple effects. But it wasn't always easy. When the Lakers were dismantled by the Celtics in the 2008 finals, physically dominated, pushed around in the paint, Gasol became the scapegoat. Critics labeled him soft. They questioned his toughness. They wondered if he had the grit to win in June. Phil Jackson never flinched. Instead of shielding Pau from criticism, Jackson challenged him. He didn't scream or humiliate. He expected more. In practice, he demanded physicality. In film sessions, he questioned effort. And in the quiet moments between games, he reminded Pau of who he could become. Gasol responded. The next season, he came back with a sharper edge. He didn't lose his finesse, but he added force. Rebounding numbers climbed. Low-post battles became more assertive. And in the 2009 playoffs, he played like a man determined to rewrite his narrative. In the 2009 finals against Orlando, Pau averaged 18.6 points, 9.2 rebounds, and 1.8 blocks per game. But the numbers don't tell the story. It was his control, his presence, that gave LA their composure. While Kobe carved up defenses, it was Pau who kept the triangle humming. High post entry, backdoor find, pivot, pass, screen, reset. He was the engine underneath the hood. Phil Jackson never had to tell Pau to lead. He just did it. Then came the 2010 rematch, Celtics, Lakers, 7 games. This was the war the critics said Pau couldn't win. Boston's front court, Kevin Garnett, Kendrick Perkins, Rasheed Wallace, was bruising. Game 7 turned into a wrestling match. The pace slowed, bodies crashed, shots clanked. Pau didn't flinch. He scored 19 points, grabbed 18 rebounds, and battled for every inch in the paint. In the fourth quarter, he tipped offensive boards, drew fouls, and made critical free throws. The Lakers won 83-79. Kobe had 23 points on 6 of 24 shooting. It was Pau who kept them afloat. After the game, Jackson didn't offer grand praise. He rarely did, but the message was clear. Gasol had validated the faith. Looking back, Phil once said Pau was the most skilled big man I ever coached. Coming from a man who'd led Shaq and Rodman to titles, that's no small statement, but it speaks to how Phil valued thinking over brute force, and Gasol was the thinking man's center. Off the court, their relationship was built on shared curiosity. Jackson, the Zen Master, and Pau, the Renaissance mind. They talked about philosophy, literature, global politics. Pau was fluent in multiple languages, played classical piano, and read voraciously. For Jackson, who often gave his players books tailored to their temperament, Pau was the ideal student. He didn't just read the book, he came back with questions. Phil once gifted Pau the art of war, not as a tactic, but as a lens, control, patience, the discipline to strike only when it mattered. Pau understood. Even years after Phil's retirement, he has continued to speak glowingly of Gasol, not just as a champion, but as a rare kind of player, one whose humility never dimmed his fire, whose intellect sharpened his competitive edge. In a league obsessed with flash and force, Pau Gasol was something else entirely, a graceful assassin, shaped and sharpened by one of the greatest coaches in NBA history. And when Phil Jackson reflects on what made his dynasties endure, why they weren't just talented but unified, he often credits players like Pau, because Pau didn't need to dominate the spotlight. He just needed to understand the moment. And under Phil Jackson, he always did. When Phil Jackson talks about the most valuable players he ever coached, it's not always the ones with the biggest numbers or the flashiest highlights. Sometimes, It's the ones who simply understood the why behind the system. The ones who brought steadiness, trust, and clarity to chaos. And that's where Steve Kerr comes in. He wasn't the most athletic guy on the floor. He wasn't going to break down a defense off the dribble or sky for a block. But Kerr was precise, he was smart, and above all, he was reliable. In Phil Jackson's world, that was gold. Kerr joined the Chicago Bulls in 1993, just as Michael Jordan stepped away from the game for the first time. The timing could have made him an afterthought in a franchise in transition. Instead, he became a key cog in what would become one of the most iconic dynasties in sports. Under Jackson, Kerr thrived. Not because he changed who he was, but because Jackson understood who he was and gave him the structure and confidence to excel. Phil didn't need Steve Kerr to be a star. He just needed him to hit the right shots and never shrink from the moment. And Steve never did. He was the embodiment of what made the triangle offense work. Spacing, ball movement, trust. He wasn't just a shooter. He was a decision maker. A player who made the next pass when it was smarter. A player who slid into the corner without being told. A player who never forced but always delivered. One of the defining moments of Kerr's career and his relationship with Phil came in Game 6 of the 1997 NBA Finals. The Bulls were tied with the Utah Jazz, 86-86, with seconds left on the clock. Everyone in the arena expected Michael Jordan to take the final shot, but in the huddle, Jackson gave his players room to speak. Jordan turned to Kerr and said, half-jokingly, "Be ready." Kerr didn't flinch. Moments later, Jordan drove and kicked. Kerr caught, rose, released, bucket. Bulls win. Championship secured. In the post-game press conference, Kerr joked, "I was wide open, so I just knocked it down. Thanks, Michael, for the pass." It was classic Kerr, humble, dry-witted, self-aware. But beneath the humor was a key truth. Phil Jackson trusted Kerr with everything because he earned it. What Jackson appreciated most about Kerr wasn't just the clutch shooting. It was his professionalism, his voice in the locker room, his ability to act as a translator between the stars and the role players. He was the kind of player who knew the temperature of the room and could raise it or cool it down as needed. Kerr also understood Jackson's methods. Where some players rolled their eyes at the Zen books or the Native American rituals, Kerr respected them. He once said that Phil's spiritual approach didn't always land the same with every player, but the message always came through. That message for Kerr was about intentionality, doing things with purpose, playing without ego. In Jackson's memoir, 11 Rings, he mentions how Kerr brought joy and intelligence to every team. That wasn't lip service. Kerr was the kind of player Phil could plug in during high-stakes moments because he trusted him not just physically, but mentally. In the triangle offense, every position is interdependent. Players have to read and react. There's no bailout ESO play, no simple give it to the superstar plan B. Everyone has a role. And for the triangle to hum, players like Kerr were essential because they executed without hesitation. It's easy to overlook a guy averaging under 10 points per game, but when Phil Jackson reviewed tape, it was often Kerr's actions that unlocked a possession, a well-timed pin-down screen, a quick swing pass that turned into an assist, a smart foul to stop a fast break. It wasn't glamorous, but it won games. Kerr would win 3 championships under Phil Jackson in Chicago, 1996, 1997, and 1998. Each time, he was the quiet constant, available, aware, and unshaken. Their relationship didn't end when Kerr left Chicago. Years later, as Kerr entered coaching himself, he often cited Phil Jackson as a foundational influence, from the emphasis on balance and mindfulness to the belief in empowering players rather than dictating terms. Kerr absorbed Jackson's philosophy and made it his own. In interviews, Kerr has called Jackson the most unique coach I've ever seen. He's spoken about how Jackson valued team consciousness and how that shaped Kerr's own approach when coaching the Golden State Warriors. And the admiration went both ways. Jackson once said that Kerr was one of the few players who didn't need to be reminded why we did things a certain way. That may sound simple, but for Phil, whose methods were often more psychological than tactical, understanding the why was everything. What made Steve Kerr special to Jackson wasn't just a shot in Game 6 or a clutch performance in practice. It was that Kerr never needed the spotlight, but was always ready when it found him. He was the proof that success wasn't always about force, it was about flow. And for Phil Jackson, who spent his career orchestrating harmony from chaos, that made Steve Kerr unforgettable. So here is the list of players who plays under Phil Jackson coaching. Now, if you want to know 7 basketball players Bill Laimbeer hated the most, then watch this video appears on your screen. This will blow your mind. And also, if you did not subscribe to the channel, please subscribe it and hit the bell icon and like the video and comments your thoughts.